first question probably is what on earth do I know about recruiting people? Because I'm not a recruiter. That's not my background at all. My background is sports psychology. My passion, my real interest, I guess, has been to study the world's best. And in some cases, that means studying the world's best leaders, studying the world's best organizations and teams. And in doing so, I found that the way that they hire people and recruit people is very different than to most people and most businesses and most organizations. So what I'm going to share with you now is essentially what I found from studying how the world's best approach this question. How do you hire great people? And interestingly, having spoken to many leaders about how they put together world-class teams, one of the answers is, well, you have to start with wonderful people. If you hire great people, then there's a very good chance you'll build a great team. So this is where that comes from. First thing I'm going to do is actually ask you guys a question, though, and this is from your own experience. What's the cost of getting it wrong? I mean, you've probably hired people, you've recruited people into teams, or even if you haven't actually employed people, if you've hired suppliers that haven't been great, or you've partnered with people that haven't been great, what's the downside? What's the cost of getting it wrong? And there might be many dimensions to this question. There could be a cost to your team, the impact it has on your team if you bring in people that aren't right. There'll be the time investment, I suspect. There'll be probably some pounds, shillings and pence investment into this that you may not get back. So on all sorts of levels, it could be reputational, whatever. What's the cost of getting it wrong? And also, what's the upside when you get really great people? What do great people bring that average people don't? And what's the extra that you get from them? So have a think about it. If you've got a notepad in front of you or whatever, or you're making notes on your PC, feel free to capture some thoughts on this, because I want to get your thoughts, just to share the experiences and find out what the difference is between hiring great people and hiring duff people. So whenever you've got any thoughts, let me know. Either stick your digital hand up or unmute yourself and hop in. We'll go with the cost of getting it wrong, first of all, because I suspect that's the one that most people understand more easily. Neil, what do you think?
I can share experiences, not from my founders thing, but when I was leading kind of big teams in London, is that there are a number of different things. If I brought the wrong person into what was design teams,
yeah,
is that there would be a cost on training if they weren't necessarily skilled enough. There would be an effect on the other members of the team because they would feel like they were carrying, or there was a different influence, or there was a different culture that would be there. And then there's the time on yourself to manage these issues, and then the effort of what do you do to help them move on.
Yeah.
And all of those kind of connected things can happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually in a small team, that can often be amplified. It's sort of diluted across larger teams, that effect. But if in a small team, if you bring a bad person into a team of 5, that's a huge percentage of that team, and it's going to have an impact very, very quickly. Yeah, Chris, you have to unmute, Chris. You're
Yeah, I was going to say, from my side, you see it occasionally going around like the LinkedIn social media. I think there's quite a significant monetary cost from what I can remember. I think in the region, and the last thing I think was about 12,000 was the average cost that they kind of estimated it would cost a company to, get rid of that hire somebody new and stuff like that. Now that might actually be a lot lower, because I think that was a good few years ago. So yeah, I think there's a very significant monetary cost. Yeah.
And I think, you can reduce the cost if you act quickly. Many people don't act quickly enough to bring it down to that level either. But yeah, even that would be an expense you probably don't want to experience too often. Rob, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't mind sharing an exact thing that's happened to us just recently, hot off the press kind of thing. So small team of developers, 3. We brought in the 3rd to replace someone else who didn't work out. And new guy comes in, expensive, 10 grand's worth of recruitment fees later. It took us 2 months to work out that he was using the term I used earlier, confidently wrong. He was a massive bullshitter. His CV was brilliant. He somehow passed our tech test. That's the bit that we're going over now, working out how on earth that happened. It didn't take too long for us to work. You go through excuses to start with a code base that people need to learn it. So they take some time to get up to speed. And then you then start to wheedle out the fact that this person doesn't know what they're doing. And then you've got the cost of undoing all the bad that they've done within a code base that can destroy a product.
Wow.
So the cost of getting it wrong within software development is bloody massive.
Yeah.
And the pain of the recruitment fees is bloody massive. And it's not just the cost of that, it's the time to recruit, to do the tech test, to do the cultural fit test, to do all the wraparound stuff involved in onboarding and a new member of staff, and then offboarding them and locking all the systems down and changing passwords. And yeah, huge.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you get into the almost those other ripples that you're talking about, or the extensions of those ripples, then you start to see where the real impact is. Stacey, what are your thoughts on this?
To build on what Rob just said, I would, and what you just said, the ripples are more intense than what you would even imagine. Finding ways to communicate in different ways with a person with whom you thought would fit, that doesn't. And the emotional toll, not only that it would take on you, but the team and even beyond, and anyone else that they have worked with on behalf of initiatives and projects and things like that you're working on. And then really, I think probably the biggest part is that discernment between, is it you, is it them, is it the team fit, and trying to really sort out those pieces and then the approach forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And as your mind starts going, you could probably start to estimate a pound, shillings and pence value to it. I asked a sales director this question a few years ago, and he said, when you take into account the recruitment fee and the training costs and the salary that you're going to pay them and all that sort of stuff, conservatively, he said in his world, it was 25,000 per head. And he said it could easily be double that, depending on how long we keep them and all that sort of stuff. And in sales, just like Rob was saying, you give them a certain amount of time because you don't get sales straight away, just like you don't learn the code base straight away. So you know, there's always time into it. Sometimes they were holding on to people 6-9 months before they said, actually, you know, this isn't working, and no more excuses. So yeah, it could be quite extensive, that financial cost before you get into reputation. Next question though, what's the benefit of getting it right? What does a good person bring that an average person doesn't bring? If you get a really good person, you know, one of those superstars, what do you get over and above a normal, regular, average Joe? Any thoughts on that? Yeah, Gary?
I would just think like efficiency, and you personally not having to deal with them. So yeah, more about your time than anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and the fact that you can kind of leave people to get on with things and figure things out, and they're usually quite self-sufficient and they usually drive solutions themselves. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Rob?
Transformative gain, where the cost becomes a non-issue.
Yeah. So they become kind of profitable very, very quickly in lots of senses. Yeah, Chris?
I was going to say, from our side, it's massive. It is almost like the difference between, you know, somebody plays striker at your local football ground and somebody plays striker for a Premiership football club. It is literally that 2% difference, and it probably is only that sometimes, just incredibly different. And it's, you know, certainly in our world, you know, although we're experts in helping companies recruit, it is so difficult to find just that 2% difference, which we need. It's unbelievable. And it's, you just almost can't quantify whether it's, you know, whether it's a personality thing or whether it's a drive thing or whether it's a communication thing. It's just almost has to be everything. So yeah, for us, it's incredibly, makes such an incredible difference.
Yeah. Last up, Lawrence, what are your thoughts on this?
Finding a new opportunity in your business that you didn't know about, a business in a business that you didn't quite know was there until someone comes in and finds it for you.
Yeah. And that stuff, actually, you probably don't even realize until they do it. It's one of those, you lose in missed opportunities until somebody gives you that benefit and you think, wow, yeah, what if more people could do that? What if we could find more of these sorts of people? Brilliant. Well, the reason I asked this question, and actually when I asked the sales director, the flip side of the question, what's the benefit of getting it right? What does a great salesperson bring that an average one doesn't? He said it's probably conservatively, again, somewhere in the region of an extra £125,000 a head in revenue that they bring in. So the gap, conservatively, between somebody that's garbage and going to cost you money and somebody that's great who's going to bring you more, in his world was about 150k. And the reason I ask this question is because recruiting great people is more difficult. It takes more time. It takes more effort. It doesn't usually cost more money. It definitely requires more thinking. So it has to be worth it. And if we start off by thinking, okay, hiring great people as opposed to average or garbage people makes an incredible difference, it's worth spending the extra time, effort, thinking, and focus on this, because it will require more. So if we've got that framed, then we can start to ask some other questions. Just reflect on this one. I'm not going to ask you this one. How do you currently identify talent and potential at the moment? If you're recruiting, what tools do you use to recruit people? What tells you whether the person in front of you is great, average, rubbish? What have you got? When I ask that question to most business leaders, I get the usual suspect answers, which is we use CVs, we use interviews, we might use a few psychometrics. That's our tool set. And then I ask them, what do you learn about the person from those tools? And I'm not asking about what do you learn about their qualifications or whatever. I'm asking about the person, the human being. What do you learn about them? What do you learn about their character from those tools? And as we go through the thought process, in fact, I'll ask the question, what do you learn about a person from their CV? What does it tell you about the human being in front of you? Not much. And that is probably the issue, isn't it? I mean, if you think about what's on a CV, it's got their job history, yeah. It doesn't, and it tells you what roles they were in, what their job titles were, but it doesn't tell you whether they were any good at them, whether they actually knew what they were doing or not. It doesn't tell you that. Chris, what are your thoughts?
From my side, it just tells you how good they are at writing a CV.
Okay.
Because honestly, some of the best candidates we see have shocking CVs initially, and we have to do a hell of a lot of work on them. And on the flip side, actually, we get bombarded by international CVs, and they're great, they're amazing. But actually, when you start scratching below the surface, there is absolutely nothing there. Not in all cases, but in quite a lot of cases, they are just fantastic CV writers.
Mm. And I don't know whether you see this as well. I asked this question to a business leader once who said, well, at least we can tell whether their maths and English is decent, whether they can communicate, their presentational skills, all that sort of stuff. And the person sitting on the other side of them said, if they wrote the CV. And that's not guaranteed. Just for interest, how many CVs do you see that people haven't written themselves, that they've sort of outsource that in some way?
Probably, if the UK candidates we get, most of them probably have, and actually they tend to be bad.
Okay, right.
Ironically, like I say, on the international, more we get, when we do international work, the more international CVs, the CVs are a lot better, but actually, like I say, they look like they're all professionally done. They almost look like they're a copy and paste of the next person. So it's so much harder with international candidates, we find, to actually understand how much of that they've done.
Yeah because I mean, I was working with the son of a friend of mine to help him get his headspace right. He was transitioning from playing professional golf into work, and he was profoundly dyslexic. And yeah, I looked at his CV and you wouldn't have known it because he said, well, I didn't write that myself because why would I? I'm profoundly dyslexic. It would look rubbish. So CVs might not tell us very much. Next question, how much do you learn about the person through an interview? What are your thoughts? If you've interviewed people in the past, if you've seen interviewing being done, how much do you learn about the human being in front of you from the interview? What do you learn about them from the interview? Any thoughts?
It depends what you ask them.
Oh, go on, Owen first, go on, say again.
I'm saying it depends what you ask them. So I actually have a person, whenever I interview, I have a personal section where I ask them about their hobbies, interests, what they've done outside of work, what they like to do, why they go to work.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, you have to take a bit with a pinch of salt because they're in an interview scenario, so they're still going to tell you, frame it, I guess, in a way that what they think you want to hear, but you can get a bit of a feel for them. Yeah.
So I think, yeah, the questions that you ask and how you interpret the answers makes a huge difference. You know, those are two things that I think really do affect what you learn through an interview. Gary.
These are not. These are just answers that I'd think it is personality and attire as well. What they actually look like. Though with personality, I should imagine a lot of people who are in interview status don't really show their real personality anyway.
Right. And I think for a very short period of time, or relatively short, human beings are very good at presenting a front. You know, they can present something, usually what they think the person in front of them wants to see. And yeah, this is why you can get people who are brilliant in an interview and rubbish when they get into the role. You know, they just happen to be fantastic at presenting themselves. And if that is the skill you're looking for, brilliant. If it's not, maybe we're looking at the wrong things. Chris?
I'm going to say, obviously, this is my thing, but it's, you know, I think you get a real sense of whether or how good their CV actually is, you know, whether it is a true reflection of what they've done. So when we interview candidates, you know, quite often you'll go, well, crikey, a lot of that, which you've just told me, isn't on your CV. We need to add that and broaden it out. And flip side, you know, other candidates where you're like, you haven't really done that, you've touched on it. And a good example is where somebody from, say, a bigger corporate has got all the buzzwords on the CV, but actually they've come in what I call crank the handle. They've taken over from what somebody else has done. So you flip that over into a startup environment. They haven't actually been the one who's gone white paper job. How do we build out this process, this system, this technology? And that's a totally different skill set.
Yeah. Yeah. So you can kind of dive into how much do they know within topics. If you've got some knowledge yourself. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Neil, thoughts?
Well, all the interviews I've ever conducted have been for creatives, so there's always a level of work that you're seeing in front of people. So you're seeing the test, and obviously you're seeing, and you can actually see some of their design work. Obviously, there's the risk they didn't actually do it, but you can see some of the fundamentals. So for me, it was always like, can you space type properly? Because if you can't, then we're going to have lots of bad conversations moving forwards. But then it became so much more about chemistry. And that's almost like a weird thing to, you know, is that if you felt like you could actually discuss creative topics, if you felt like you could bounce ideas off them within a creative space, and if they felt comfortable, so actually then getting into, you know, rather than talking about, you know, your career and your career history, it's getting into the problem solving, getting into ideas, getting into seeing how they think, was the way that I used to conduct my interviews. Once you know that the fundamentals were in place and they could space type correctly.
Yeah, brilliant. Ollie, last thought.
I used to have a technique. It worked, and it was very direct and simple. And it was, name your two, you know, sort of on a case study approach, biggest successes in your career, and name the two biggest failures. Now, if someone can't put that together in an interview and be candid, maybe they're not for you.
So interestingly, the reason you are asking those questions is to see candid answers, not really bothered about what the answers are. You just want to see that the person's willing to be that honest. And actually now we start to get into where interviews might be useful, or the kinds of things that might be useful in them. Because even, I think one of the traps is lots of people, when they come out of an interview, reflect on the level of rapport, which is slightly different than Neil's talking about chemistry, in my view, how easy it was to develop that conversation. Because if we're relying on that, or we're weighting that too heavily, we might end up employing somebody who can develop rapport quite easily. But if that's not the number one thing we need in them, then we've skewed our weighting towards that, and probably employed somebody that we thought, and this is another sort of error in my view, we call that cultural fit, and it's not. Cultural fit is whether people are going to live your values, and that's different than developing rapport. So if we're really careful about how we use the interview, we might be able to squeeze something out of it. But if we're not, there's a good chance that we'll probably be looking at the wrong things, judging the wrong things, and end up employing somebody who ultimately might interview very well, but might not actually do a great job or fit with the organization. There's another trap, I think, within interviews, which is those competency-based questions, because what you will hear from people is whether they know what to do. What you won't get is whether they're actually going to do it or not. There's a huge gap often between knowing and doing. So you might find out that they know what to do, but whether they're capable or willing to do it or not is an entirely different thing. And one of the experiences that I shared in the book, in Hire Great People, I was interviewed for a position, my first ever job in Premier League football. I met the manager in a hotel in Mayfair, and he said to me, "What would you do?" So this is for working with Premier League footballers. "What would you do if they start playing up?" And I gave him the answer that I knew was the right answer. I said, "I would put a rocket up their backsides." And he said, "Brilliant." And in that moment, I was thinking to myself, would I? I've never worked with Premier League footballers before. I've worked with other international sports people, but not the egos of a Premier League footballer. I don't know whether I would put a rocket up their backsides. You know, that requires a fair bit of courage. I've never done it before, but I knew it was the right answer. And this is part of the trap with competency-based type questions. So there are holes in it. Even psychometrics have got holes. You know, I've worked in the field of psychology for nearly 30 years. I've used loads of psychometrics. Most, if not all, that I've come across are self-report measures. Even those personality type, you know, insights or Myers-Briggs or whatever, DISC profiles, even those are self-report. If I knew that you were looking for somebody who was incredibly detail orientated, very methodical, I-dotter and T-crosser, I could present a profile that told you I was that person. I'm not. I'm the complete opposite. I'm rubbish at all those things. But I could present that in a profile if I wanted to get the job and I thought that would get me the job, I could create that. And so even those aren't completely watertight. So we've got to be really careful about what we learn from these, or understand what we truly learn from these, and then probably take a view on them. What I would say, the world-class organizations I've come across, they do use these, but they absolutely don't rely on them, is the key. They know that this tells them a little bit about a person, but not very much. So they're not going to rely on that, and they're going to make sure they use some other tools to really learn about people. So worth reflecting on. Here's a challenge that I was thrown back in 2006. So I was working in the Olympic programs with an organization called the English Institute of Sport, who provided sports science support to the GB Olympic programs and the England teams. And my challenge was, we've just secured the London 2012 games. How do we know which athletes currently in our youth programs have got the potential to stand on the podium in 6 years' time? So in 6 years' time, they're probably going to be late teens, early 20s, maybe mid 20s. Rewind the clock back 6 years, we're talking about teenagers here. How do you know which of this squad of swimmers, for example, 40 swimmers ploughing up and down a pool, which of these kids could stand on a podium in 6 years' time? That was my challenge. And to answer it, I've subsequently learned that this thinking that I used has also been used in lots of other environments. Quick pop quiz. Any NFL fans? Anybody know who this is? Any guesses? There are points available. This is a guy called Bart Starr. He was, his surname's quite apt, he was the absolute stellar quarterback of his generation. He played for a Green Bay Packers team in the 60s under a coach called Vince Lombardi that won the first 3 Super Bowls. He was the Super Bowl MVP, the most valuable player. He was the league MVP. He was the absolute superstar of his day. This is also Bart Starr a few years earlier. He was the 3rd choice quarterback in his college team. He played for the University of Alabama. He was not their first choice. He was not even their 2nd choice quarterback. He was the 3rd choice quarterback. And yet a few years later, he's the #1 player in the league. He's the absolute stellar superstar player. So one of the questions is, why did the Packers even recruit him in the first place? Now, admittedly, the Packers didn't make him their #1 choice. He was recruited in the 17th round of the draft. And when you dig into it, there was a conversation between the personnel director at the Packers and the basketball coach at the University of Alabama. These two were friends. And the basketball coach said to the personnel director, this kid is the first in the gym, and he's the last out of the gym. He's the one who will always ask the coaches more questions. He's the one that does more analysis on his game. He's the one that not only works hard lifting weights and all those sorts of things, but he's the one that's practicing his skills when everybody else has gone home. This kid looks like a great learner. I reckon this kid's got potential. And that was the basis on which the Packers drafted him. And he went on to become the superstar player of his generation just a few years later. So that thinking was the same sort of thinking that I used to pick out the teenagers that could become superstars of the future in Olympic sports. So the challenge is, you've got all these swimmers, they come in, they blast up and down the pool. I started by asking the coaches, and lots of the coaches I was working with had coached European champions of the past, world champions, Olympians of the past. So I said to them, if you look at that kid when they were 13, 14, the one that went on to become a European champion or a world champion, what did you see in them? Were they the quickest when they were 13 or 14? And the coaches said no. Said at the age of 13 or 14, the stopwatch won't tell you the future superstar. It'll only tell you who's quickest today. And in 13 and 14-year-olds, that could be due to the fact that one kid's 6'4" and one kid's 4'6". So you've got to look for other things. I said, okay, so what do you notice? And they talked about work ethic. They talked about whether people could improve themselves, what happened when they hit the hurdles, what happened when they got injured, how did they respond to critical feedback, all those sorts of things. That's what it'll tell you. So I started very simply. I sat at the front door, usually on a very cold, wet November morning at 6 o'clock when it's dark outside, sat at the front door of the swimming pool, and I asked the kids some questions as they came in. So one kid comes past and I said to them, what are you working on today? And this is a like 14-year-old kid. So they went, oh, I don't know, kind of grunted at me and shrugged. Next kid walks in. I said, what are you working on today? And they said, I'm working on my turns. Ah, interesting. I said, why turns? Well, I've had these competitions the last few weekends and my turns are a bit ropey. So sometimes I'll come into the wall in first place. After the turn, as we go out, I'll be in 5th. So I need to work on my turns. I said, okay, cool. Off you go. And then I sit back and watch them. And the kid who grunted at me is just going through the motions. Yeah, sure, they're doing the training session, but they're going through the motions. They're swimming up and down, flopping around the wall, swimming back again. They're not really paying attention when the coach is giving feedback. They're not putting everything into the training session. They're talking to their mates and all that sort of stuff. The kid who said to me, I'm working on my turns, I can see them working on the turns. They're not all perfect by any means, but they are working on them. As they leave that at the end of the session, I say to the first kid, how did that go? All right. I say to the second kid, how did that go? And they said, well, they're better. I've learned some stuff. The approach into the wall is really crucial. So if I take my last stroke too late, I'm too crunched up. I haven't got enough room to get my feet over, so I don't get my feet flat on the wall, so I can't get a good push off. And if I take my last stroke too early, I lose all my speed. I sort of glide into the wall, lose the momentum, and then I can't get out quickly. So the approach is everything. Okay, cool. See you tomorrow. Next morning, I'm sitting at the same place by the front door. First kid walks in. What are you working on today? I don't know. Second kid walks in and I say, what are you working on today? And they look at me like I'm a bit thick and they say, still turns. And off they go. And I'm thinking, okay, if you were going to put your mortgage on one of these kids, who do you reckon might be the future superstar out of the two of them? And actually it becomes blindingly obvious. And if you watch them working for a few weeks, it probably takes, a month or two for the gap to start developing, but you see a gap. And actually 6 months, 12 months down the line, one of them gets selected for a GB squad and the other one can't figure out why, because in their head, they've been doing the same training. So when you start to know what you're looking for, this stuff becomes obvious. So I was looking for how they trained, how they applied themselves, what they did that the others wouldn't do, what they were eating and drinking when they left. Were they eating a chocolate bar and drinking a can of pop, or were they eating fruit or flapjack or whatever? One of the things that the nutritionist had been talking to them about, or protein bar. And you can also start seeing where the gaps appear. I was really interested to look at things like how they review their performance. Do they make excuses? Do they take responsibility? Do they focus only on winning and losing, or do they focus on their performance and the process and what they need to work on? When do they compromise? What do they compromise on? Do they arrive early? Do they arrive late? Do they take shortcuts? All that sort of stuff. What happens when they hit those tough challenges? What happens when they get injured? What happens when they lose form? What happens when they get deselected? That stuff is going to tell us who's going to be in this for the long haul and who's going to get those results over the course of 6 years. Now, those are the kinds of things that you look for with athletes. They are characteristics, importantly. We're looking for character. We're looking for things like courage. We're looking for things like honesty, and we're looking for things like resilience. They're characteristics. World-class organizations recruit on character. It's more than personality. It's not just whether you're a good eye dotter and a T crosser, or whether you're a good ideas person or whatever. That's the level of personality. We're talking about characteristics here. So, question is, that's all well and good for swimmers. How does that relate to business? So just quickly, what are your thoughts on, and I'm going to stop the share just so that we can check in on this. I say I'm going to stop the share. I've got to find the right button first. There we go. How do you think this might relate to you? How does this thinking relate to you? How does it relate to business? Because you guys aren't working with people who charge up and down a swimming pool all day. Sorry.
Yeah, I think that in many ways it's directly transferable in the way that what we're looking at. I feel like, so I have my own company, but before I used to be a director of a business analytics company for a customer success team. And what we did was we tried to have a case study. So we gave them data, and then they had to, on their own time, come back with a report and then present it to us. And so I feel like in a way, we did the same thing where we looked at how much effort that they were putting into this case study. We then did a postmortem where we asked them to analyze their own performance, how they found it, what they put into it, what they could have improved. And so I feel like you're getting the same outcome of observing character through, kind of the same exercise of, interviewing, but also giving them something to work on.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've started to tap into actually what you can do is you can start testing some of these characteristics. So I've often asked people to present something, give them some feedback, and then see what they do next. And what I'm actually looking for is whether they're willing to take on board critical feedback and use it and apply it. Whether this kind of hit of critical feedback is something that they respond positively to rather than respond negatively to. Whether they're interested in honest conversations, whether you can have an honest conversation to critically review something is the bit that I'm really interested in.
And I feel like that hits on the point of, having humility. And also, to me, it also reminds me of this idea of beginner's mind. And that's a Japanese concept that essentially, we focus on the fact that we are always a beginner and we're always humble and curious. And so I feel like you could, again, test that through what you mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, we're starting to get to the heart of how we can start recruiting on character. There are a couple of really fundamental pieces. These are not complicated. Okay, it's not easy. Simple and easy are not the same thing, but this stuff is not complicated. This is simple, but it's not particularly easy to do. The first thing we need to do is understand the kind of characteristics that we need. There are a couple of trapdoors. The first trapdoor is if I tend to say to businesses and business leaders, tell me the characteristics that you're looking for, they'll write down 20 or 30 characteristics. They'll describe a superhuman. You're never going to find a superhuman. So I often say the top maybe 5, but probably 3 or 4. 5 is a push, but the top 3 or 4 characteristics that are an absolute non-negotiable for you, that you need in these people. And they can be a blend of organizational characteristics, as I call them, the things that we need in everybody across the organization, no matter what the role is, and some that might be role specific. I'll give you an example. So there's a reason that Sherlock is on the screen here. I was chatting with a client of mine. He was the head of R&D, or the director of R&D in an engineering business. They were recruiting for a post. They needed a specialist repairs person. They'd had a repairs function before, but they hadn't had a specialist person in it. So essentially, one of the engineers, whoever was free, used to jump on the repairs, but they needed somebody to head up their repairs team. Just one role to start with. And I asked Paul, the R&D head who was recruiting for it, what kind of person do you need? And he started to describe, I need somebody who will just go and go and go at the problem. They'll probably hit a dead end, they'll come back, they'll hit another dead end, they'll come back, and they'll just keep going until they find a solution. He said, I need a detective. I need Sherlock. Brilliant. Let's see if we can go and find Sherlock then. And when you've got a really clear understanding of the kind of person that you're looking for, and it might be a persona like Sherlock, it might not be. If any of you guys follow rugby or sport, I was actually asking this question to an NFL team, and amazingly, the answer they came back with is a guy called Kevin Sinfield, who played rugby league for Leeds. He's on the England Rugby Union coaching staff at the moment. They said, we need somebody like that, and essentially described a person that isn't naturally talented, but would just relentlessly develop themselves. They push themselves and push everybody else around them to become the best they could possibly be. They've got that real drive to become better and better and better and better. That's the persona that they describe to me. But if you've got a good idea of the kind of characteristics you need, the top 3, 4, 5 at a push characteristics that you need, and I would say put these in rank order. Say the number 1, if we could only have one characteristic, I need this one. It might be, for example, you need tenacity, you need resilience, or you need somebody who's a self-starter or whatever. That's the number 1. If I could have a second, I'd have this one. If I could have a third, I'd have that one. Put them in rank order so that you've got a very clear idea as to the sort of person that you need. I'd also say with this, you've got to get a good understanding, particularly if multiple people are involved in a recruitment process, of what we mean by that word. So if we say honesty, do we mean somebody that's never lied before in their entire life? Or is that not what we mean by honesty? Do we mean something else? Because lots of times we can use a word, resilience, honesty, whatever. But if I've got one meaning in my head and you've got a different meaning in your head, we end up looking for different things. So a really clear idea about what we mean by these things. And once we've got that, then we can go to the next stage, which is to test for these characteristics. And this is critical. Don't ask people about them. We're not saying, tell me a time when ... or tell me when you were once, challenged by X. We're going to put them in a position and make them demonstrate this characteristic. So the reason that there's some soldiers on the screen there, And these have got to be very contextual. They've got to fit you and your organization. The Special Air Service and Special Boat Service require, absolutely 100% need people to have tenacity, the ability to just keep going no matter what. And they don't want to say to people, tell me a time when you had to be tenacious, because they'll get a story. It might not even be the person's story that they're talking to, the candidate's story. It could be some, one that they read or saw in a movie, or their brother's story or whatever. So they're going to put people in a position and make them demonstrate tenacity. The way that they do it is they stick a 30-kilogram pack on their back and they say walk. And, if you were given that challenge, probably one of your first questions would be, well, how far? For how long? The answer is until we tell you to stop. Well, what do you mean? An hour, a day, a week, a month? Until we tell you to stop. And that's the challenge. Just keep walking and walking. What happens if I get blisters? Keep walking. What happens if my feet fall off? Keep walking on the stubs. What happens if my legs fall off? Crawl. That's what they're looking for. And it's such an essential characteristic for a special forces soldier. They know that if people get to that point where it's too tough and they give up, they'll probably get captured and then interrogated or killed. That's the reality in their world. So they create this test, and you can't talk your way around it. You've got to do it. So if we understand what testing really means, I'll give you an example to work through. If you wanted to test courage, courage is your ability to go towards the things that you're scared of. So the way to test courage is to face the thing that you're scared of. So how could you test to find out whether somebody had courage? How could you see it? What are some ideas? Rob, what do you think?
Well, you surely need to know what they're scared of in the first place to be able to test that.
Absolutely. So let's say we found out that this person was scared of spiders. How could we do it?
Short of scaring the bejesus out of them.
Well, if you think about the simplicity of this, if we got ourselves a nice little tarantula, black hairy, black and orange hairy thing, popped it on the desk, we'd soon find out whether they had courage or not. Because they're going to be scared, absolutely, but do they run for the hills, or do they hold their ground? Would they even approach it? And we're not saying you've got to pick it up or cuddle it or whatever, but that response will tell you whether they've got courage or not. And that's what we're talking about. Put somebody in a position, challenge them, make them demonstrate the characteristic that you're looking for. That's the way to test for it. And there are all sorts of fairly simple tests that we can use. I'll give you an example of, sometimes we need to stretch our thinking on this. So a client of mine was looking for, they were in the recruitment business and they recruited HR professionals. My client, he was the CEO of the business. He was looking for somebody to head up one of his teams, and he wanted somebody who was incredibly driven, determined, would do whatever it took to succeed. That was the sort of persona that he described. I'm not going to say it was maybe the right answer or the best answer, but that's the person he wanted. And so I said, okay, how would you find out whether the person in front of you had those qualities? He said, I don't know. I said, okay, you don't have to use this test, but let's just stretch our thinking. What happens if you said the interview is at 7 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday in one of those little stone bothies, those little stone shelters in the middle of the Cairngorms in Scotland? That's where the interview is. He said, well, hang on a minute. Just to get there, they'd have to do whatever it took. They'd have to get up at stupid o'clock in the morning. They'd have to drive 7 hours to Scotland. They'd have to navigate their way to the bothy. They'd have to get all the protective clothing. They'd have to get maps and compasses and all that just to reach the bothy. I said, okay, yeah, great. So what would your interview consist of when they arrived? He went, tea or coffee? I mean, they've shown you everything that they need to just to get there in the first place. So you don't need to use that test, but it stretches your thinking and starts to get you into that mode of How would we find out whether this person's got those characteristics? On a much, much simpler level, I'll give you another one. So a client was looking for salespeople. One of the things that they wanted in these salespeople was adaptability. The ability to go, okay, fine, I'll give that a go. I've never done it before, but I'll give it a go. It's outside of my comfort zone, but I'll give it a go. So what we said to them is, don't just send us your CV. When you apply for the job, you've got to send a 30-second selfie video explaining why this job is of interest and why you think you might be good at it, or what skills you've got to bring to it. Interestingly, that acted as a really valuable filter for them. They found that quite a lot of people weren't even willing to do that. If you're not willing to just do a selfie video and send it with your CV, you're never going to have the characteristics required for this role. You know, if that's enough to stop you. One of the other things I recommend to people is, when you've got these characteristics, you can find out whether they're valid or not by kind of testing them on your own people. Your better people should pass these kind of little challenges and tests quite easily, and the people that really struggle in your organization will probably struggle with these characteristics. So the sales director for this particular team had categorized her team into 1s who were the high performers, 2s who were the middle performers, and 3s who were her lowest performers. And she gave them all the 30-second selfie video challenge. The 1s did it. They weren't TV presenters or anything like that, but they did it. The better 2s did it. The lower 2s didn't, and the 3s didn't. And she said, that tells me quite a lot then. So that's a really simple little test that she used and that organization used as a filter right at the beginning to understand whether these people have got this quality adaptability that they were looking for. So it doesn't have to be as daft as sending people off with a 30-kilogram pack on their back, or using a tarantula, or sending them to the Cairngorms. It can be quite simple stuff, but we've got to test the characteristics that we're looking for. To do all of this, because this is an attritional process, you know, we're going to create hurdles for people. Not everybody's going to pass the hurdles. To do it, we need a queue outside the door. We need to become a magnet for talent, as I describe it. We need to become the place that really good people want to be. And when I look at world-class organizations, you know, and I studied teams like Red Arrow's teams and SAS units and whatever, they've got a queue outside the door. You know, if I was looking at sports teams, I'm looking at maybe the All Blacks rugby team. Every kid growing up in New Zealand wants to play for their country, men and women's now. You know, they want to play for the All Blacks, they want to play for the Silver Ferns, whoever, because they're an absolute draw. So how do you become that place that every great person wants to belong to? They don't want to work for just anybody, they want to work for you. How do you become that place? Sorry, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that at the core is you have to practice what you preach. So the characteristics that you're looking for, I think you have to align that with the actions that you exhibit, because I think that's how naturally people would be attracted to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And depending on what your industry you're in, there might be some slightly different variations on this. So I'll give you a little example. I was chairman of governors at the kids' school a few years ago, when they were in primary school. And I was talking to the head teacher. We had a bit of a revolving door in one of our classrooms. You know, a teacher would come in, they wouldn't last very long, off they'd go. And I was asking the head teacher, well, what's behind all of this then? And she said, well, recruitment's really difficult. We just have to take the best of a bad bunch usually. I said, talk to me about that. What do you mean? She said, well, you know, we've only got one way of advertising. We stick a notice in the job section on the local authority job board. We get whichever applicants we get, and they're not very good usually. We've got a classroom. You can't have a teacher, a classroom with no teacher in it. So we have to appoint someone, and then we end up recruiting the best of the bad bunch. I said, that sounds like a pretty rubbish strategy to me. And she said, well, nothing we can do about it. I said, no, I don't accept that. So I started asking teachers, why would you choose one school over another? Now, one of our challenges is we were a little village school of less than 100 kids, not one of the big secondary schools, you know, that tends to draw people. Honestly, in terms of career progression, most people wouldn't have looked at a little village school of less than 100 kids and said, that's what I need for my next career step. So I said to her, what do teachers really care about? And I asked quite a lot of teachers, what do you care about? You know, which schools would you go for? And they said, word gets round. So we know where the good schools are, because people walking away from those schools tell everybody else that's a great school. If there's ever a job there, apply for it because it's a brilliant school. I said, well, what tells you that? And they say, well, the kids are well behaved. The other staff are great. The parents are great. They seem to be, you know, achieving good things. When you walk into the place, it's neat, it's tidy. The kids are all polite, blah, 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 blah. So I said to our staff team, every single person that leaves this school needs to go away saying exactly that stuff. How do we make that happen? And so we worked on it for a year, for 18 months. Every single person, whether they were an educational advisor, a teacher from another school, a head teacher visiting, a parent, whatever, everybody, even the guy that came in and did the maintenance work, left saying, that's a bloody brilliant school, that is. If there's ever a job there, you want to apply for that. And we saw the impact it had on our applications. We went from having a couple of pretty dodgy applications to having 5, 6, 7. We could actually shortlist people from that. We ended up recruiting somebody for a new class that we needed, and we shortlisted to 5. We had 3 really strong candidates, 2 who would have been brilliant, but we only had 1 position. So we offered them, you know, 1 person the job, the best person. When the head teacher retired, we had the record highest number of applicants for any job, teaching job in the county, including all the big secondary schools. We had 13 applicants for our head teacher's position. We were going to shortlist 4. We ended up shortlisting 5. There were 3 who would be absolutely brilliant for it. We narrowed it down to 2, but we could only have 1 head teacher. So we selected the best of them. And that came from being a place that had to accept the best of a bad bunch. And we turned it around in 18 months by understanding what the magnetism was, what it was that would attract really good people to want to work here above any other job. So if we can get that bit right, then we can start creating a queue outside the door. Then we can start getting picky. The trap, of course, is if you've got a position and you need to fill it, you know, as a friend of mine once said, if you need to put a bum on a seat, you could end up with a bum on the seat. So, you know, if we're in that position where we're desperate, we're unlikely to get really good people. So we've got to create the queue outside the door. So I'm aware that I've kind of whittled on now for quite a while, and we've got a few minutes left. So if you've got any questions, let me know, hop in. Any thoughts, any observations, any questions, anything?
Simon, that was excellent. It was a good reminder how brilliant you are. And I mean that. And it takes me back to when Start to Stand Up was very much in its infancy, and you came along and did a masterclass then. So that's really good. Thank you for that.
Well, thank you.
Any questions for Simon on what we've just heard? Has it provoked anything in any of you to ask a question? Rob, then Stacey.
Characteristics wise, across all the different types of companies you've worked with, are there 1, 2, or 3 absolute standouts that always keep coming back?
Yeah, there are some usual suspects. And I think some of these are a function of modern times. Resilience tends to come up time after time after time. Being a self-starter, being able to drive your own performance tends to come up time after time. Those aren't just true in business. Those work into education, into healthcare. They're predominant characteristics when I'm talking to elite sports organizations. One that people probably don't really know how to vocalize particularly, but seems to be really important, is to be a great team player. And in most organizations, that's also really important. So yeah, those tend to crop up time after time. They're what I call the usual suspects. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Basic.
Not a question in so much as just what I'm really kind of picking up from all of this is grit being one of those. And I think it's Carol Dweck I cannot think of her name, but she's done quite a bit of research on grit and what that means. The other is integrity.
Yeah.
So getting really to the root of maybe it's passion or purpose or why, the why something exists, and then building the foundation from that up.
Yeah. And actually, I mean, I don't employ people, but I recruit quite often, suppliers, partners, you know, joint venture partners, whoever it is. And integrity is one that I place a huge value on. Yeah. And if I know that in the past, if I found suppliers, whether they be web designers or whatever, video editors, and they haven't had that, it's not been a great working relationship. So yeah, that's one that I price really highly. Yeah.
Thanks, Stacey. Neil.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Wonderful talk. I really appreciate the, you know, the connection between sport and also the business thinking. I had the privilege of being an elite racing cyclist and followed a lot of the ideas that Sir David Brailsford put in about marginal gains, which I used a lot in my design career as well. No, not going for the silver bullet, but actually how can we improve a lot of small things a little. But then also I've got involved in kids football as well, which is building that team, and that's taught me a lot about management. I guess the question or the thought that's there, and forgive other football fans, I'm going to mention Brighton Hove Albion here, but there's an interesting thing that's going on, and I'm in conversations with a club at the moment about some things, is how they've built a really good team by not hiring superstars. And, you know, they have a policy of not hiring superstars where it's all about growing talent, bringing in, you know, wise old men, but they have a culture that seems to survive. Like the guy at the end of my road who runs the news agents always says, well, what's going to happen when you sell your superstar? I said, well, we'll be fine because we've got a culture that will resist that. And we've got a culture that will build new talent. So, yeah, just thoughts on that, you know, that and how sport can be used to actually change, you know, business thinking.
Yeah, I've also worked with quite a few teams who haven't had the superstar, haven't really needed the superstar. Interestingly, what tends to happen is superstars kind of emerge from those environments. They go on to other places and probably don't shine as brightly in those other places. And actually, when you see where this works well, and for football fans of approximately my age, you'll probably remember players like Phil Neville, who looked amazing in the Man United team, went anywhere else, didn't look quite as good. Because actually probably he wasn't the superstar player, but he was brilliant within that system. And actually the ethos of the time was that we're creating people who put the team first, who understand. So the way I describe it often is they're like the drummer or the bass guitarist in a band. You know, they understand the importance of playing their part, and that when everybody plays their part, the team functions. Even I read a piece from Eric Clapton once, who said, my job is 5% of the time to be out front doing the thing, and 95% of the time to be just in the band playing my piece. And so even those superstars, when you get them right, understand that is the role. It's not always to shine. It's to be part of the team and then shine when you need to, and then back part of the team again. And some of the best coaches that I've worked with understand that. So, for example, there was a footballer once, Claude Makelele, played for Chelsea, first name on their team sheet. And when you look at the stats, Claude Makelele's stats aren't spectacular, but when you look at the other players, all of their stats get better when he's on the field. Frank Lampard's particularly. If you look at Frank Lampard's stats, his skyrocketed when Makelele was in the team. So their ability to make the others around them shine is also something that great coaches look for. Yeah, and again, when you're looking for characteristics, you've got your eye cued into those things. Yeah, because you know that's going to make your team sing.
Thanks, Neil. That was great questions. Great questions. Simon, we can't thank you enough. We will, because we're going to give you a lot of love and big ups today on LinkedIn. So yeah, you have to take it, I'm afraid. So
I'll do my best.
That's what we do at Start. All right. So thank you very much, and hope to see you soon.